Picture a bus stop. It's cold. It's always cold in South Park, Colorado. And there's snow on the ground, which is just sort of the default condition up there in the mountains. 4 small figures standing in a row, waiting for the school bus, and one of them is wearing an orange parka with the hood pulled so tight you can barely see his face. That's the image. That's where it always starts. If you've watched South Park for any amount of time, that image is probably burned into some very specific corner of your brain. The bus stop, the 4 boys, the snow. It's one of those television visuals that has become so familiar it barely registers as a choice anymore. It's just how the show looks. It's just how it begins. And of the 4 boys standing there, 3 of them have perfectly visible faces and fairly legible personalities from about 30 seconds in. Stan Marsh, Kyle Broflovsky, Eric Cartman. You know who they are almost immediately. And then there's Kenny. Kenny McCormick is, I think, the most recognizable character on South Park, and also the one people know the least about. Which is a genuinely strange thing to be able to say about someone. You could drop his silhouette into a crowd of 1,000 animated kids and pick him out without a second thought. The orange parka, the hood cinched tight over his face, the muffled voice that sounds like someone trying to talk through a pillow. He's completely iconic in terms of design. And yet, for most of the show's history, he was the one you heard least from. His face was hidden, his words were mostly inaudible. And more often than not, he died before the episode was over. There's a quiet irony, I think, in making a 2-hour video about a character who spent his first 5 seasons being almost impossible to see or hear. But that's sort of the point, isn't it? Kenny is a character who was always doing more than he appeared to be doing, always containing more than the show bothered to surface. And when South Park finally did start pulling back the curtain on him, properly, I mean not just as a joke, what was underneath turned out to be genuinely worth the wait. So tonight we're going to take it slow and go through all of it. Where he came from, who he is, what's actually going on with the dying, why his sister matters so much, what the Cthulhu stuff means, what it means that he became a millionaire scientist in a dystopian future, and what he ultimately chose to do with the one truly remarkable thing about him. It's a lot of ground, but we've got time and there's no rush, and that's sort of the whole point of being here. I've been thinking about Kenny a fair bit recently in the way you do when you fall down a lore rabbit hole at a genuinely unreasonable hour of the night, and suddenly it's 3 in the morning and you've been reading South Park wiki entries for an hour and a half. He's one of those characters who rewards attention. The more carefully you look, the more is there. Which sounds like something you might say about a Dickens novel, not an adult animated comedy built on fart jokes and shock humor, and yet, here we are. If you're new here and this sounds like your kind of thing, do consider subscribing. We do this sort of slow, detailed lore dive fairly regularly, and there's a lot more South Park to get through. But for now, let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the house. The McCormick family lives in a bungalow. And I say that in the loosest possible sense of the word because calling it a bungalow is being fairly generous. It's a rundown, visibly struggling structure on the poorer end of a town that isn't particularly wealthy to begin with. There's a dismantled car sitting in the front yard, which is home to assorted stray cats and dogs. The inside is dirty, stained, and sparse. The television is a monochrome set. The games console is a ColecoVision, which, if you're not familiar, is a device from 1982, making it roughly 15 years out of date even by the show's early seasons. And the food situation is, to put it gently, limited. We learn across various episodes exactly how limited. Frozen waffles for dinner with no side dishes. Bread sandwiches for breakfast, which is to say bread as the filling inside other bread. Pop-Tarts on a good day. There's one episode where Kenny wins a can of green beans for his family. Actually wins it, which is a nice moment. And they can't open it because they don't own a can opener. The can just sits there. That detail has always stayed with me. Not because it's played for tragedy, it isn't, but because of how matter-of-fact it is. Of course they can't open it. That tracks. Kenny's dad is Stuart McCormick. Stuart is unemployed, alcoholic, and not particularly functional on either count. He inherited his drinking from his own father, which is a detail the show slips in quietly and doesn't belabor. He argues with his wife constantly. Sometimes the arguments turn physical, and from what the show shows us, it appears to go both ways. Carol gives as good as she gets, more or less, which doesn't make it better, just more accurate to a particular kind of household. When Stuart is sober, which is not especially often, he's apparently loving and caring. But sober Stuart is a bit like a bus that only comes twice a week. You can't exactly plan around him. Carol McCormick, Kenny's mom, works washing dishes at Olive Garden. She had Kenny when she was very young. The show implies she had her eldest child, Kevin, when she was somewhere around 13 or 14, which tells you something about the speed at which the McCormick family's circumstances came together. She's not a villain, she's just a person whose life got very full very quickly and who didn't have a lot of tools to manage it with. She and Stuart share a love of drinking and, at times, drugs. There's a scene in The Fractured But Whole where the two of them are overheard arguing about meth, which turns physical, which then somehow pivots into Stuart declaring his love for her, and the two of them deciding to get high and have sex, which is both horrifying and, I don't know, strangely honest about a certain kind of messy, chaotic domestic life. Kevin is Kenny's older brother. He's untidy, slightly unhinged in the specific way of teenage boys in dysfunctional households, and mostly argues with Stuart. Kenny watches their fights from the sofa with what the show describes as a bored look. Not frightened, not upset, just bored. He's seen it. It's Tuesday. Then there's Karen, the youngest. But we'll get to Karen properly in her own section because she deserves it. Kenny is, by every visible metric, the poorest kid in a school full of kids who aren't exactly wealthy to begin with. Cartman, who is not poor, exploits this constantly. He'll offer Kenny $1 to do something dangerous or disgusting, and Kenny, fairly often, takes the deal. Not out of desperation exactly, more out of a combination of pragmatism and the fact that growing up the way he did, the risk-reward calculation looks a bit different when you've been eating bread sandwiches for breakfast. And yet, there's an episode called The City Part of Town, where Kenny gets a job at City Walk, a restaurant, working for actual wages. And his whole reason for doing it is to save up enough money to buy Karen a doll. Not for himself, for Karen. He works, he saves, he buys the doll. That's it. That's the whole subplot. The show doesn't make a big deal out of it, doesn't wrap it in sentiment or score it with strings. It just shows you what Kenny does when he has a bit of money and some time to spend it. There's a line somewhere in a South Park philosophy book written by a professor at Southern Illinois University about how Kenny functions as the show's daily encounter with death. And that's true in the literal sense of the death gag. But I think he also functions as the show's quiet reminder that poverty is not a personality and that the poorest kid in the room is not necessarily defined by what he lacks. Kenny doesn't complain. He doesn't perform his hardship. He just lives it, works around it, and quietly takes care of the people he loves, using whatever he's got. His tombstone in the show's opening credits reads, "Sleep well, little child, the Lord holds thee now." Which every time I think about that, I'm genuinely not sure whether to laugh or not. The answer, I think, is both. South Park is, at its core, a show about 4 boys. It's been that since the beginning, and despite the fact that the show has sprawled outward enormously over 27 seasons, adding Randy Marsh as a quasi-protagonist, building out the whole PC principal universe, doing entire seasons structured around streaming service wars and Amazon capitalism. It keeps coming back to the same 4 kids at the same bus stop: Stan, Kyle, Cartman, Kenny. The show needs all 4 of them, even when it forgets to use one of them properly for a few episodes. Stan Marsh is Trey Parker's stand-in, roughly speaking. The moral everyman, the one who tends to have a conscience about things, the one who gets dragged along by the chaos around him and sometimes manages to stop it and sometimes doesn't. Kyle Broflovsky is the conscience made explicit. He argues for what's right, he has strong feelings about fairness and decency, and he is almost always ignored. Eric Cartman is the id made flesh, manipulative, bigoted, scheming, genuinely brilliant, in a way that's disturbing precisely because it keeps being deployed for the worst possible ends. Cartman is the engine of most of the show's plots. He's the one who wants things badly enough to do something completely unhinged to get them. And Kenny is... what? How do you describe Kenny's role in the group? The honest answer is that it shifted over the years. In the early seasons, his role was fairly simple. He was the poor kid, the one who died. The group needed 4 members, and Kenny filled the 4th slot. His personality was there. He was clearly a bit filthy-minded, he had opinions, he made his friends laugh, but it was mostly expressed through muffled speech that nobody could understand anyway. He was a presence more than a character in those years, a necessary piece of the composition. But underneath that, even from early on, you get flashes of something more. Kenny is the most selfless of the 4 boys, almost unremarkably so. He doesn't compete for status the way Cartman does. He doesn't moralize the way Kyle does. He doesn't agonize the way Stan does. He just shows up, goes along, and occasionally does something quietly extraordinary that the show barely stops to acknowledge. His friendship with Butters is worth mentioning here. It's one of the show's warmer relationships, and it doesn't get discussed much. There's an episode called Going Native, Season 16, where Butters, in an unusually lucid moment, says that Kenny is the only kid at school with any real dignity, that he's not fake, not stuck up, not performing anything, just genuine, which is such a quietly devastating bit of characterization for a show that doesn't tend to hand out sincere compliments without immediately undercutting them. And in the same episode, Kenny holds Butters' hand to help him through a difficult moment, in exactly the same way, the show notes, that he holds his younger sister Karen's hand. It's the same gesture, the same instinct. He's a caretaker. He's been one his whole life, probably because he grew up in a house where somebody had to be. There's also the muffled speech thing, which is worth sitting with for a moment. Kenny talks through his parka hood, and the result is that everything he says comes out as an approximation of language rather than actual words. You can sometimes make out the shape of what he's saying, and the show's creators have confirmed that he's usually saying something spectacularly inappropriate. The muffled hood is partly a joke. It means he can say absolutely anything without being censored, because nobody can clearly hear it anyway. But it also functions, accidentally or not, as a kind of storytelling device. Kenny is the one character whose inner voice is least accessible. You have to pay attention. You have to lean in. And if you do, you'll find someone worth listening to. In terms of how the group dynamic actually works, Stan and Kyle are best friends, the closest relationship in the show. Cartman is Kenny's best friend, in the way that a black hole is your best friend. He's the one Kenny spends the most time with, partly out of habit and partly because Kenny is tolerant in ways that Stan and Kyle sometimes aren't. Cartman exploits Kenny relentlessly, uses him for schemes, and takes his stuff. Kenny mostly lets it happen. Whether that's loyalty or just the path of least resistance isn't always clear. Possibly both. What is clear is that Kenny is, in a group of 4 boys who are all doing their own loud, messy, complicated things, the one who is most reliably and quietly decent. He dies for his friends, he works for his sister, he doesn't ask for recognition. The show spent a long time treating this as background noise, and then it started paying attention. Let's talk about the deaths. In the first 5 seasons of South Park, Kenny McCormick died in almost every single episode. And when I say died, I don't mean metaphorically or off-screen or implied. I mean he died on-screen, graphically, in ways that range from mundane to completely surreal. He got hit by a truck. He was struck by lightning. He spontaneously combusted. He was eaten by something. He fell from somewhere. He was crushed by something falling on him. He exploded several times and in several different contexts. The methods were creative and they were varied, and the show's writers clearly enjoyed the challenge of coming up with a new one each week. And after it happened, Stan would turn to Kyle and say, in exactly the same tone every time, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny?" And Kyle would respond, "You bastards." And that was it. That was the whole ritual. Then the next episode, Kenny would be at the bus stop again, alive and completely fine. And nobody would mention what had happened because nothing had happened. It simply hadn't occurred. The show had reset. This was, for years, understood purely as a joke, not a deep joke, just a running gag about television's willingness to kill its characters without consequence. South Park was a show built on the principle that nothing needed to stick, nothing needed to matter, and you could do whatever you liked as long as it was funny. Kenny dying was part of that philosophy. It was the most extreme expression of it. Death as punctuation, death as routine. The show treated it as such. Nobody questioned it within the fiction. Nobody in South Park ever sat down and said, "Hang on, our friend died last Tuesday." The amnesia was total and universal and completely on purpose. The joke only works if everyone plays along with the pretense that the death never happened, and the boys and the town did so flawlessly every time. By Cartman joins Nambla, where Storten Zaith and Iwalarorstone, which is the 53rd episode of the series. There's a quiet moment where, after Kenny dies, Mr. McCormick says something like, "This must be the 50th time this has happened." And Carol corrects him. 52nd, she says. So even at that point, the show was keeping account in a small way in the background. The parents know. They've been through it enough times to argue about the number. That detail is mostly played for a throwaway laugh, but it plants a seed. There is an explanation here somewhere. The show just hasn't told us yet. What the deaths were actually doing in those early seasons was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, shock value, dark comedy, a recurring gag that audiences came to anticipate. But underneath, Kenny's deaths were a kind of meditation on consequence, or the lack of it. The show was making a point, pretty consistently, that death in animated television didn't actually mean anything because it was always undone. Kenny was the vehicle for that observation. Every time he died and came back, the show was nudging you. Nothing counts. Reset. Begin again. There's something almost philosophical about that if you let yourself look at it for long enough. A character defined by dying. An audience trained to expect the death, watch the death, and then accept the resurrection without question. It normalized a cycle that, if you actually stopped to think about it from inside the fiction, would be absolutely horrifying to live through. Which, and here's the thing, is exactly what the show eventually made it. Some of the deaths are genuinely iconic in their own right. There's the one where a stray bullet comes through the wall during dinner and takes Kenny out while the family is sitting there eating Pop-Tarts. There's the time he was mauled by something, the time he got infected with something, the time a crowd of people trampled him. Each one is specific enough to feel crafted, like somebody sat in a writer's room and thought, all right, what's the most absurd way we can do it this week? And there is something joyful about that in retrospect, the sheer commitment to it. Hundreds of episodes, hundreds of deaths, and the show never stopped treating each one as worthy of its own specific invention. What changed starting around season 14 is that the show stopped treating it as pure comedy and started treating it as something that actually had a cost. Not for the audience, the deaths were still funny. But for Kenny, the cost was his alone to carry. And once you understand that, everything that came before looks different. Season 5, Episode 13. Kenny Dies, aired December 5th, 2001. This episode is different from every other death episode, and it announces that immediately. There's no random truck or spontaneous combustion here. Instead, the boys find out that Kenny has been diagnosed with a terminal illness. The show never names it on screen, but Parker and Stone confirmed in interviews that it's meant to be muscular dystrophy, a real disease taken seriously, not played for laughs in the way you might expect. The diagnosis is genuine. This time, Kenny isn't coming back from it in a week. The episode splits its attention between two storylines that turn out to be connected in a very South Park way. In one thread, Cartman discovers an opportunity to restore federal funding for stem cell research. He goes before the House of Representatives and gives what is, by any measure, an extraordinarily affecting speech about his dying best friend, arguing passionately that the research could save Kenny's life. He then performs Heat of the Moment by Asia to seal the deal. The House reinstates the funding. It's one of the funniest and most absurd things the show ever did, and it's happening simultaneously with one of its most genuinely moving storylines. Because in the other thread, Stan cannot handle it. Stan, who is usually the group's moral center, who is usually the one who pushes through discomfort to do what's right, Stan cannot make himself visit Kenny in the hospital. He avoids it. He finds excuses. He tells himself there's still time, that the stem cell research will work, that he doesn't need to go yet. Chef gives him a gentle, honest talk about death, about how God doesn't always stop bad things from happening and there isn't always a reason for it. And Stan starts to process what's actually happening. He decides to go. He gets to the hospital. He goes to Kenny's room. The room is empty. Kenny's teddy bear is on the floor, still half holding onto the bed. Kyle is there. Stan asks what happened, and Kyle says he just stopped breathing, that it was over. And then, and this is the detail that I think about more than any other detail in the episode, Kyle says, his last words were, "Where's Stan?" That's it. That's the gut punch. Not a dramatic last speech, not a heroic moment. Just a kid in a hospital bed in the last moments of his life asking where his friend was. And his friend was too scared to be there. Cartman arrives at the funeral and drags Stan and Kyle away to show them the miracle, which turns out to be a Shakey's pizza. He never wanted to save Kenny, he wanted his own Shakey's, and he used Kenny's terminal illness and the stem cell funding to make it happen. Kyle loses it and beats Cartman up in the car park. Stan, in a weird way, feels slightly better after this revelation, because at least now he knows he wasn't Kenny's worst friend. Cartman was. Cartman wins that title, by some margin. Kenny stayed dead for most of season 6. The show brought in Butters as his replacement, and then briefly Tweak, neither of whom quite fit the space. The absence was real. The group of 4 became a group of 3 with an awkward gap in it. Red Sleigh Down, the Christmas episode at the end of season 6, is the only episode in that entire run where Kenny appears. Just once, briefly, almost as a ghost of himself. He comes back properly at the end of the season, almost without announcement. The show doesn't make a ceremony of it. He's just there again, and nobody asks where he's been, because of course they don't. They never do. What's interesting about the Kenny Dies episode in retrospect, knowing what the show eventually reveals about the nature of his deaths, is how it changed the rules temporarily. The gag was always, Kenny dies, nobody cares, see you next week. Kenny Dies broke every part of that formula. He died slowly, people cared enormously, and he didn't come back the following week. The show was testing whether the death could mean something and finding out that yes, it could, enormously. That test informed everything that came after. Kenny's return at the end of season 6 is not a moment. It doesn't have a dramatic reveal or an in-world explanation. He's just there at the bus stop like he always was, wearing the orange parka. The other boys don't acknowledge that he was gone. The show doesn't offer a mechanism. If you blinked, you might have missed it. And that, I think, was a deliberate choice, because the absence had already done its work. The show had demonstrated over the course of an entire season exactly what the group looked like without Kenny. Slightly off, slightly incomplete, like a table with one leg that's just a tiny bit shorter than the others. And it didn't need to make a speech about his return to communicate how much his presence mattered. He was just back. Things were right again. What's worth noting about this period is that the deaths started changing in character, even before the mythology was explicitly established. As the seasons moved through the mid-run, Kenny died less frequently. The "oh my god, they killed Kenny" ritual became occasional rather than constant. When he did die, the show sometimes took it more seriously, sometimes gave it more weight than the old gag used to carry. Part of this was practical. Parker and Stone have talked about feeling artistically constrained by the death gag. If every episode ends with Kenny dying, that's a structure you have to work around or through, and after 5 seasons of it, they'd explored it pretty thoroughly. But part of it was also that the show was doing something interesting with Kenny's character in this period, slowly and without announcement, giving him more screen time, letting him speak more clearly, occasionally, putting him in situations that required him to have a personality rather than just a function. The Mysterion reveal, which is still a few seasons away at this point, retroactively reframes all of this quieter middle period. Because once you know that Kenny has been dying and coming back his entire life, and that he's aware of it, and that the awareness is a source of genuine anguish for him. All of those unremarked returns from death become something different. Every time the show reset without acknowledging his death, it was accurately portraying what Kenny's life actually was. A cycle he couldn't break and couldn't explain, surrounded by people who couldn't remember it happening. The joke was, and had always been, the horror. It just took the show a while to say so out loud. There's something to appreciate about that pacing, actually. The show built its mythology quietly. It didn't rush to explain Kenny. It let him exist as a background presence and a running gag for years. And then, when it finally decided to look at him properly, all of that accumulated history was there to draw on. Every death you'd laughed at suddenly had a person behind it who'd lived through it and remembered and was exhausted and alone with the knowledge. That's a remarkably effective piece of long-form storytelling for a show that's famously allergic to taking itself too seriously. And once you know that, once you've had the Mysterion revelation and you go back and watch an early episode where Kenny dies and nobody reacts, it plays differently. The comedy is still there, the joke is still intact, but underneath it, there's now this other register you can hear, the sound of someone going through something alone. The show made all that room for both things at once, and the early episodes only got richer for it. Season 13. The boys of South Park decide to form a superhero team. This is the premise of the Coon and Friends trilogy, and on its surface, it's a parody of superhero comics, superhero movies, and the particularly American tendency to treat vigilantism as aspirational. Cartman, predictably, assigns himself the leadership role as the Coon, a raccoon-themed superhero who is mostly just Cartman in a costume, complete with all of Cartman's worst qualities translated into spandex. The other boys pick identities: Toolshed, Stan, the Human Kite, Kyle, Mosquito, Clyde, Iron Maiden, Timmy, and so on. And Kenny is Mysterion. Mysterion is different from the other costumes. He has a dark cape and a mask and an unmistakable gravity to him. A seriousness that doesn't feel like a kid playing pretend. While the rest of the group is bickering about credit and arguing about whose superhero name is better, Mysterion is focused. He's treating this as real because in a way it is. He has an actual power. And unlike the others, it isn't fun. When the Coon asks Mysterion to explain his power, Kenny tells them plainly, he can't die. He's been killed many times. He wakes up alive every time. And nobody ever remembers that he died. His friends don't believe him. They assume he's exaggerating, that he's making something up to sound impressive. So Kenny, in a scene that is one of the most genuinely shocking things that South Park has ever done, even now, pulls out a gun and shoots himself in the head. Right there in front of them. His friends are horrified. They're screaming, they're crying. They can't process what they just witnessed. And then the next day, Kenny wakes up in his bed, alive and completely fine. He gets dressed. He goes to school. He meets his friends at the bus stop. Not one of them remembers. The look on Mysterion's face in that moment, and when he realizes again that the memory has been wiped, is one of the most effectively communicated things in a show that deals primarily in broad strokes and loud colors. And then he does it again, later in the trilogy. He shoots himself in front of them a second time at the very end because he wants to make a point that will be forgotten by morning. "I'm tired," he says. "I want to go to bed." And then he does it. His friends are horrified all over again. They'll forget by morning. They always do. The scene cuts. We see his mother, Carol McCormick, bolt upright in bed, grabbing her stomach, screaming. It's happening again. And in the next shot, she's holding a newborn baby in an orange parka and placing him gently in a crib. She turns to her husband and says, with a kind of tired regret in her voice, "We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting." And there it is. That's the explanation. Not a particularly grand one, not a particularly mystical one. Just Kenny's parents went to a cult meeting and this is what happened. The emotional weight of those Coon and Friends episodes is substantial, even by the standards of a show that has always been capable of surprising emotional depth when it chooses to deploy it. Here's a child who is trapped in an endless cycle of dying and returning, and the worst part of it, the detail that the show lingers on, gently but clearly, is not the dying itself. The dying is survivable, obviously, in the most literal sense. The worst part is that he is completely alone with it. Every death is private, every return is silent. He holds this impossible thing inside him, and there is nobody to tell, because even if he tells them, they won't remember. There's a moment in Coon vs. Coon and Friends where Mysterion is in a conversation with Captain Hindsight, who is complaining about the burden of his own power. And Kenny tells him, with quiet exasperation, that he is the last person who should be talking to him about curses. Captain Hindsight's power is that he can always see in retrospect what should have been done differently. A power that works only after the damage is done and is therefore useless. Kenny's power is that he cannot die, and somehow, in that moment, Hindsight's useless power actually sounds like the better deal. There's also a detail worth noting here about Cartman. In an earlier episode, Cartman Land, Cartman offhandedly says that Kenny dies all the time and seems to have some residual awareness of it, more than the other boys at least. The fan theory is that Cartman received Kenny's eye in a corneal transplant at some point, and that this gave him a partial, flickering connection to Kenny's perspective. The show never confirms this, but it also never denies it, and it does fit. The idea that the person with the most access to Kenny's experience is the one who is least equipped to care about it and least inclined to is a particularly South Park kind of cruelty. Now, the trilogy does eventually get around to an explanation. After Mysterion reveals his power to his friends, or tries to, given that they never retain the information, the Coon and Friends trilogy begins digging into the mythology. Kenny, still in his Mysterion costume, goes home and confronts his parents about something he's been piecing together. He asks them about a cult, specifically a cult dedicated to Cthulhu. Stuart and Carol, who are at this particular moment smoking crack on the couch, admit that yes, they were part of a Cthulhu cult for a while. They were members, they attended meetings, they were involved in whatever rituals or ceremonies Cthulhu worship involves. And here is the reason why, stated plainly and without any attempt at justification: free beer. The cult offered free beer. That's it. That was the full extent of the decision-making process. Kenny's entire cosmological condition, his immortality, his curse, his decades of dying and returning, the anguish of being the only being in South Park who truly understands what death is, exists because his parents wanted free beer. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it's actually a kind of genius. Not just funny, though it's very funny, but genuinely structurally clever. In H.P. Lovecraft's mythology, Cthulhu is an ancient cosmic entity of almost incomprehensible power, a being so vast and alien that human minds can barely process its existence. The whole Lovecraftian tradition is about the horror of insignificance, about the possibility that the universe is run by forces that don't notice us, don't care about us, and would unmake us without malice simply because we happen to be in the way. It's grand, cosmic, existential dread, and the South Park version of that dread is free beer. The disproportion is the whole joke, an ancient horror from beyond space and time whose followers chant lines from the Necronomicon, who defecates on airport runways in the episode and has to be confronted by a child rubbing its belly. And the reason a human family got tangled up with it is that they were going through a rough patch, and someone in town was offering free refreshments. That's not a reduction of the horror. It's a very accurate observation about how most human beings end up in the situations they end up in, through small, foolish, completely understandable decisions that have consequences far beyond what they imagined when they were saying yes to the free beer. Now, while Kenny is processing this revelation, The Coon and Friends team investigates the South Park chapter of the Cthulhu cult. They find it at a meeting in a local house and discover familiar faces there. Mr. Adler, the goth kids, the Star Trek nerds, and Kenny, as Mysterion, hears the cult recite a line that stops him cold. The Necronomicon passage, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die." He immediately leaves the others and chases down the goth kids to ask what it means. The implication being Kenny recognizes something of himself in that line. He is in some sense that which does not die. He has been lying, dormant, returned, perpetual, his whole life. The language of the Cthulhu cult is the closest thing he's ever found to a description of his own existence, which is both clarifying and deeply unsettling because it connects him to something ancient and indifferent. His condition isn't magical or blessed, it's Lovecraftian, it's cosmic. And it started because his parents wanted to get drunk at a meeting. The other major thread in the Coon and Friends trilogy is that Cartman, being Cartman, befriends Cthulhu by approaching it with sweetness and affection rather than demands. He essentially treats Cthulhu like a large, easily pleased animal, rubbing its belly, calling it the little coon, generally behaving with it the way a child behaves with a favorite dog. Cthulhu, ancient and vast and terrifying, responds to this with what appears to be genuine delight. Cartman then uses his new friend to destroy things he doesn't like: a synagogue, some hippies, San Francisco. The contrast between Mysterion's genuine anguish about his connection to this entity and Cartman's cheerful weaponization of the same entity is deeply, darkly funny in a way that's very specifically South Park. The mythology of Kenny's condition doesn't get entirely resolved in these episodes, and I think that's the right call. We don't need it resolved. We understand enough. The cause is the cult. The nature of the curse is that he dies and returns and is alone with the knowledge of it. And the cosmic force behind it is something that, on the scale of things that matter, barely registers his existence, which is the most Lovecraftian possible ending for a Lovecraftian story. The horror isn't that Cthulhu hates Kenny. The horror is that Cthulhu doesn't especially know he's there. Karen McCormick almost didn't exist. The character was referenced in an early script for Starvin' Marvin, Season 1, but never made it into the finished episode. There was apparently a press image released of Kenny and his sister around that time, and she floated around fan circles for years before the show finally gave her a proper introduction. Her name, Karen, appeared in fan discussions long before it was ever confirmed on screen. When the show finally named her officially in The Poor Kid in Season 15, it was something of a nod to the fans who had been calling her that for years. Her full debut in The Poor Kid is quiet and unhurried in the way that the show sometimes does its best character work. Tucked into a bigger storyline, not announced as important, just there, doing its thing. The McCormick parents get into serious enough trouble with the authorities that Child Services temporarily removes the children and places them in foster care. The foster family, deeply enthusiastic Penn State fans with strict evangelical Christianity as their secondary identity, disciplines the children by hosing them down with Dr. Pepper, which is both extremely absurd and, in the way South Park often manages, not entirely unlike things that actually happen in the world. Karen is struggling. She's quiet in a way that reads as frightened rather than peaceful. She's being bullied at school. She misses her parents despite everything, despite knowing at some level what they're like, because they're her parents and that's just how it is. And she's looking for her guardian angel. Her guardian angel, it turns out, is Mysterion. Kenny, in costume, shows up at her school. He deals with the bully efficiently and without much ceremony in a way that suggests he's been doing this a while. He gets the foster parents investigated and their operations shut down. He keeps Karen safe throughout, and at no point does he reveal who he is. She calls him her guardian angel. That's what he is to her. She doesn't know that her guardian angel is her brother, the kid who watches from the sofa while their parents fight, the kid who got a job at City Walk to buy her a doll. That moment, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, I will always be there, said in Mysterion's voice to Karen, meaning it completely, is one of the most affecting things in the show's entire run. And it lands because the show hasn't oversold it. It hasn't set it up with violins or a big emotional speech. It just quietly placed it in front of you and trusted you to feel it. Kenny's line elsewhere in the same register, Karen McCormick is off limits. Said to nobody in particular, said to the universe, said as a statement of principle. There is one thing in Kenny's life that is fully and permanently protected, and it's his sister. What's interesting about Karen as a character is what her existence tells us about Kenny retroactively. Because Kenny has been in this family his whole life, in this chaotic, neglectful, struggling household. And his response to it hasn't been anger or resentment or withdrawal. His response has been to make himself useful, to protect where he can, to work when he needs to. He's been doing this quietly in the background without anyone much noticing. The guardian angel thing is just the most visible expression of something that was always there. There's also the detail that Kenny, as Mysterion, convinced his parents to start giving him and Kevin proper allowances, to fight less, to take better care of themselves and their children. He used his costume to parent his own parents, which is funny in the South Park way and also quite sad in the South Park way. The fact that it took an anonymous visit from a caped figure for Stuart and Coral to start paying their son pocket money says quite a lot about the particular dynamics of the McCormick household. Karen shows up in the post-COVID specials as an adult, attending Kenny's funeral, the first version of his death that's actually treated as final, at least for a while. Seeing her there, grown up, still existing in the world that Kenny spent so much of his life quietly protecting and trying to improve, has a weight to it. He got her here. He was always trying to get her here. South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, came out in 1999, 2 years into the show's run, and it's still, by most accounts, including mine, one of the best theatrical animated films of that decade. It does things with its R rating that are gleeful and smart and genuinely shocking, even knowing that it's a South Park property, and it manages to deliver real emotional beats while simultaneously parodying every convention it's using to deliver them. And in the middle of all of that, without much fanfare, it gives us Kenny's most heroic moment. The plot, briefly, the boys sneak into a Terrence and Phillip film in Canada, absorb an extraordinary amount of profanity, and trigger a chain of events that leads to a full-scale war between the United States and Canada. Kenny, in an early sequence, attempts to recreate a fire-breathing stunt he saw in the film and inhales the flame. He's rushed to hospital. He dies on the operating table in a sequence that is somehow both genuinely funny and genuinely sad. And then he ends up in hell. Hell, in the South Park cosmology, is not particularly grim. Satan is there, who turns out to be a fairly sensitive, emotionally complex individual in a codependent relationship with Saddam Hussein. Kenny arrives, adjusts, and finds that hell is actually manageable. He and Satan develop a rapport. They talk. Kenny, who has been to hell more times than anyone, has a familiarity with the place that Satan seems to find comforting. The war above ground escalates. Satan has been manipulated by Saddam into fighting on Saddam's behalf, using the war as a mechanism to get onto the Earth's surface and rule humanity. Kenny, watching from below, begins to grasp what's happening, and in an act of genuine courage that the film delivers with as much sincerity as it's capable of, helps Satan find the clarity to stand up for himself. Satan defeats Saddam and sends him back to hell. The war ends. Satan offers Kenny a wish. One wish. Anything he wants. Kenny could come back to life. He could be restored to the world he left. He could have his friends and his family and his bus stop back. That's the obvious wish. That's the wish any 9-year-old would make. Kenny wishes for everything to go back to the way it was before the war began. All casualties undone, all damage reversed, everyone who died comes back. Canada and America make up. The world resets, including Kenny's own death. So he doesn't come back. He's still gone. He sacrificed his one chance at a clean return so that everyone else could be whole. The boys thank him. He takes down his hood for the first time, which the film has been building to as a kind of reveal. And his face is just a kid's face, a normal kid's face, a bit like what you'd expect, slightly surprising in how ordinary it looks, given how much time has been spent obscuring it. He says goodbye, he disappears. And then, at the end of the film, as the group sings a reprise of the opening song and everything settles back into normality, a light rises from the ground, a meteor ascending, and it transforms into Kenny with wings and a halo, welcomed properly into heaven, given wings at last. I always found that ending quietly devastating in a way the film doesn't draw attention to. The movie is funny and profane and brilliant, and then it just slips that in at the end. Kenny McCormick gets his wings, not because he avoided death, but because of what he chose to do with one shot at escaping it. He gave it away. That's who he is. That's who he's always been. The face reveal, by the way. His unhooded voice was provided by Mike Judge for the film, not Matt Stone. So Kenny's real voice, in that moment, belongs to the creator of Beavis and Butthead. I genuinely don't know what to do with that information, but I think it's worth having. Season 9, Episode 4. Best Friends Forever. Kenny is walking along, absorbed in a handheld game, a PSP specifically, which dates the episode quite precisely to 2005. He's very good at it, he gets to an extremely high level, and then he gets hit by a bus and dies. As you do, he goes to heaven. And it turns out, this is the fun part, that heaven is facing a genuine military crisis. The forces of hell are massing. Satan's army is enormous. God's army is undermanned and is struggling to find a commander capable of organizing an effective defense. And then Kenny arrives, and an angel checks his file, and it turns out that he has an extraordinary gift for strategic combat simulation because of the PSP. Because he was so good at that handheld game that heaven has been waiting for him specifically. He is the chosen one. He is literally destined to be the general who leads heaven's army to victory because he spent his childhood getting very good at a PlayStation Portable. Meanwhile, back in South Park, Kenny is in a coma. He left behind a will found in his small cardboard box of possessions, which is, touchingly, everything he owns. And in it, he left Cartman his PSP. The coma deepens into a persistent vegetative state, and the town splits into two factions, roughly representing the two sides of the real-life Terry Schiavo case that the episode was directly satirizing. Those who want to pull the feeding tube and let Kenny go, and those who want to keep him alive indefinitely. Cartman is passionately in favor of removing the feeding tube for reasons that have nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with the PSP. Kyle is on the side of keeping Kenny alive, partly out of genuine friendship and partly out of not wanting to give Cartman the satisfaction. The episode won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, which is both well-deserved and genuinely funny as a fact in its own right. The Terry Schiavo parody won an Emmy. What I find interesting about this episode, beyond its immediate satirical targets, is what it adds to the larger Kenny mythology. Not the comedy of it. The heaven needs a general premise is gloriously silly, but the underlying idea. There is a reason for Kenny's immortality. He has been dying and returning for a specific purpose. Heaven has been building toward a moment when it would need him and his particular set of skills in a critical situation. He is not a cosmic accident or a random casualty of his parents' cult involvement. He is, in some larger sense, meant to be there, meant to survive, meant to keep returning until he's needed. That's a pretty significant reframe of the death gag if you let it sit. All those hundreds of deaths and returns, not random, not meaningless, but part of a process that has a destination, which doesn't make the deaths less painful or Kenny's isolation less real, but it does place him in a different relationship to his condition, less purely victimized, more unknowingly prepared. The episode also includes the detail that all of Kenny's possessions are kept in a small cardboard box, everything he owns, in a box, and he leaves Cartman his best possession because he wants to. That's the will. That's what he chose to do with his things. I don't know. There's something about that small cardboard box that I keep coming back to. It's a quietly devastating image, the cardboard box, not played as tragic, and the show never plays Kenny's poverty as purely tragic, but left out there for anyone who wants to sit with it. Here's a child whose entire estate at the time of death fits in a shoebox, and his first instinct on writing a will is to give something away to someone who, by any reasonable measure, doesn't deserve it. The generosity isn't conditional, it isn't earned, it's just the shape that Kenny's generosity takes. Outward, reflexive, asking nothing back. Even in death, he was still giving things away. Matt Stone voices Kenny, or rather Matt Stone voices Kenny's muffled speech. The approximation of language that comes through when the parka hood is drawn tight over his face. It's his voice going through a physical filter, mumbled, muffled, shaped into something that sounds like speech but isn't quite decipherable unless you're paying very close attention and have some practice. The show's creators have confirmed at various points that what Kenny is actually saying, the words underneath the muffling, tends to be spectacularly inappropriate, vulgar, profane, often sexual, occasionally violent. The muffled parka functions as a built-in censor, allowing Kenny to say things in every episode that would be completely unbroadcastable if they were clearly audible, which is funny and practical and also reveals something about the character. Kenny has opinions, he has responses, he is participating in every conversation around him with full force. The other boys just can't hear him clearly. And when Kenny's face is uncovered, his voice changes. In The Jeffersons and a few other episodes, you get glimpses of Kenny unhooded, and his speaking voice is slightly different. Younger sounding, clearer, a bit softer than you might expect. Eric Staff voiced him in those moments in a few episodes. The movie, as mentioned, gave the voice to Mike Judge, which produced something a bit more naturalistic. It's always a little surprising when it happens, not because it's shocking, but because the show has so thoroughly trained you to associate Kenny with opacity that clarity feels strange. There's a fan community tradition of trying to transcribe exactly what Kenny says in each episode. It's a small and devoted group of people who slow down the audio and listen repeatedly to catch the muffled words. Some of it has been confirmed by Parker and Stone in interviews or commentary tracks. A lot of it is still genuinely contested. I find this tradition charming in a way I can't fully explain. This act of close listening, of trying to hear what the show has specifically obscured in service of understanding a character who is designed not to be understood. Because that's the thing about Kenny's voice. The muffling isn't accidental, it's a design choice, a deliberate part of who he is. And there's something to the metaphor of it. He is the poorest kid in the group. He is the one who lives in the worst circumstances, has the least visibility, gets the fewest scenes, and he's also the one whose speech is physically impeded. He's saying things all the time, real things with real content. He just can't be heard. In the Mysterion episodes, when Kenny speaks in costume, the voice changes. It's clearer, more authoritative, carrying the weight of someone who's decided to take up space and be heard. And in those moments, what he says is important. His confession about his power, his appeal to his friends, his exhausted declaration that he's tired and wants to go to bed. The show gives him clarity exactly when he needs to be understood and cannot be misunderstood. The rest of the time, the hood stays tight and he goes on saying the unspeakable in a frequency nobody quite catches. I've always thought there's something quite honest in that. Most people are saying things nobody hears. Most people have interior lives that get muffled by circumstance or noise or just the general busyness of being around other people who are loudly being themselves. Kenny is the literal version of that, and he mostly seems fine with it. He goes on talking anyway. He's got things to say whether or not anyone catches them. There is a version of Kenny McCormick who wears a long princess dress, carries a rat on her shoulder like a familiar, and has a full anime-style transformation sequence complete with its own theme music. This version is called Princess Kenny, and she appears in the South Park, the Stick of Truth video game released in 2014, and she is treated with complete and total sincerity by the game's narrative. No winking, no ironic distance. Princess Kenny is just the person Kenny is in this context, and the game commits to it fully. The production notes from the show's art team, which have been shared publicly, reference designing Princess Kenny's power poses and roar poses. There are references to the anime backgrounds used during her transformation sequence. The rat she carries is noted in the production documentation, delivered in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone as all the other notes, as a reference to Daenerys Targaryen's dragons from Game of Thrones. So Princess Kenny is not just a girl in a dress. She is a specifically referenced, carefully designed, mythologically resonant fantasy princess figure who is also a 9-year-old boy from a broken home in Colorado. I love this. I love it without reservation, because what it shows, more than anything else, is the writer's genuine affection for Kenny as a character. They gave him a transformation sequence. They gave him power poses. They wrote production notes about his roar. That's not how you treat a character you think of purely as the disposable one who dies every week. That's how you treat a character you've been quietly building towards something for 20 years. The Stick of Truth game also happens to be where Kenny got some of the most extensive and interesting character work of the mid-run period. The game was written by Parker and Stone themselves, so it carries the same authority as the show, and it treats Kenny's history, the deaths, the poverty, the loyalty, the strangeness, as foundational to who he is rather than background color. And then there's the magic, the gathering business. Season 18, Episode 8, Cock Magic. The boys discover an underground fighting ring in South Park, roosters battling each other in a basement with money-changing hands and crowds of locals watching. The twist, deployed magnificently, is that the roosters are playing magic, the gathering against each other, not fighting conventionally. Cock magic is rooster magic, the gathering. This is the whole joke, and it's a very good one. But the detail worth pulling out. Kenny is, in the regular world, a magic, the gathering prodigy. Before the underground rooster circuit even enters the picture, we see Kenny playing against a man named Slaughterhouse and defeating him, and the boys discussing the previous night's fight with the reverence usually reserved for professional sporting events. They cite its carnage and ruthlessness. Kenny, the muffled kid in the orange parka, has been dominating grown men at a fantasy card game and earning a local reputation for it. And then, when the roosters enter the picture, Kenny develops ethical concerns about whether the roosters are happy, whether they actually want to be in this. He advocates for the roosters. He buys one, named McNuggets, and takes him under his wing, intending to teach him magic, the gathering properly and with respect for the rooster as an individual. This is absolutely in keeping with everything we know about Kenny. He's the kid who buys his sister dolls and protects people in costumes. Of course, he has ethical concerns about the roosters. The episode ends with McNuggets competing in a hybrid volleyball/magic, the gathering tournament against the South Park girls volleyball team, which is, I think, the perfect South Park conclusion to a Kenny storyline. Quietly competent, unusually principled, completely absurd. Jump forward 40 years. The year is somewhere in the 2060s. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in 2020, is apparently still a defining feature of life in this future. Though its grip is finally beginning to loosen, South Park looks different. There are palm trees now somehow. Stark's puddle has nearly dried up. South Park Elementary has been expanded into South Park Elementary Plus. And Kenny McCormick is dead. This is how post-COVID opens. With the news of Kenny's death reaching his old friends who are scattered and estranged and have not been in contact with each other for years, Kyle gets the call and reaches out to Stan. Jimmy Valmer, who has become the host of a late-night talk show, is interrupted mid-taping to be told that his old friend has died. And the details that emerge about what Kenny was in this future are, for a character who spent his early life eating bread sandwiches and getting hit by trucks, something extraordinary. Dr. Kenny McCormick, eccentric scientist, millionaire philanthropist. He was working on something important, something to do with understanding and perhaps reversing the damage of the pandemic or the causes behind it. And he died in what appears to be a laboratory accident connected to a time travel experiment. He left behind a letter, cryptic and careful, addressed to his closest friends. I'm about to expose the truth. In the event of my death, I have hidden away all relevant information. My closest friends will know where to find him. Him? Not it. Him. The investigation proceeds through the specials with the structure of a mystery, and what it uncovers is both funny and genuinely moving. The clues lead the boys to Kenny's laboratory and then to Kenny's remains, hidden, for reasons of plot that I won't spoil entirely, in a place that requires the retrieval of a hard drive from inside his body, which is handled with exactly the level of dignity you would expect from a South Park production. The boys are forced to work through their estrangement and old grudges to get the information out. What's on the hard drive is a video, Kenny in his lab, addressing his friends directly. And the message is not what they expect. He doesn't name a villain, he doesn't reveal a conspiracy. What he reveals is himself. That he has spent his entire adult life trying to fix the bro ship. That he watched Stan, Kyle, and Cartman stop being friends during the pandemic. Watched them drift into bitterness and withdrawal and mutual grievance. And that this, the failure of that friendship, is what he identifies as the true source of the bad future they're all living in. A future with no hope and no connection, and a virus still rolling on, and a world that stopped believing anything would get better. He calls them my 3 dickhead friends. He says that after they let their friendship end, they became combative and pessimistic, and that the world took on the shape of their failure. He built a time machine. He tried to go back. To fix it. I've been trying to fix your broship my whole life, he says in a voice that is tired but not angry, just honest. And then the video shows him apparently traveling back in time and his lab assistants dying in the accident and the machine going dark. There is a new strain of the virus in this future, discovered and cataloged by Kenny's research. It's named after him, McCormick. The man who grew up in a house with a ColecoVision and a can of green beans he couldn't open has a coronavirus variant named after him. That's both a tragic irony and aoi in the specific language of South Park, where the absurd and the meaningful share the same sentence, a kind of honor. What the post-COVID specials add to the long picture of Kenny as a character is this. He became, in adulthood, exactly who he always was. Quiet, working, directing his intelligence and energy toward trying to fix things for the people he loved. He didn't do it for credit. He didn't broadcast it. He left notes and hid data and hoped his friends would find it. The whole of his adult life was a Mysterion routine on a larger scale. The guardian angel, still in the costume, still not asking to be recognized. And the coronavirus named after him doesn't feel purely like a joke. It feels like the show acknowledging, in its particular way, that Kenny McCormick was always the character closest to death, and maybe, in this future, the closest thing to a solution. There's a scene near the end of the Coon vs. Coon and Friends episode that I want to spend some time on. The coon and friends have just defeated Cthulhu, more or less. Bradley, who turns out to be the actual chosen one, not Kenny, has sent the creature back to whatever dimension it came from using the power of Mintberry Crunch, which is both a superhero name and a cereal flavor. Everything is resolved, sort of. The crisis is over, and all of the boys, Toolshed, Human Kite, Mosquito, Iron Maiden, Mintberry Crunch, are standing around celebrating, thrilled about Bradley's real superpowers, excited about what just happened. Kenny is there too. He is not celebrating. He is standing slightly apart from the group, watching his friends rejoice over a victory he helped make possible. And nobody has acknowledged that he was stabbed in the chest earlier in the episode and came back from it. Nobody remembers. Nobody ever remembers. He says, "I'm tired, I want to go to bed." And then he pulls out a gun and shoots himself in the head. His friends are horrified, screaming, devastated, just as they were the first time he did it, just as they'll be again, just as they always are. The horror is genuine, the grief is real, and it will be gone by morning. The scene cuts to his mother jolting awake, screaming, clutching her stomach. Then to her placing baby Kenny in his crib, wearing the tiny orange parka. She turns to Stuart and says, with a kind of exhausted regret, "We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting." I want to be honest about what that scene does to me. It's not funny exactly in the way that most South Park jokes are funny. It's something else, something in the same family as funny, but further along the spectrum toward genuinely affecting. Because what Kenny does when he shoots himself that second time is not an act of despair. He's not suicidal in any conventional sense. He's making a point. He's trying to show his friends what his life actually is. He knows they'll forget. He does it anyway, because even if the memory doesn't hold, the act of doing it, of making them witness it for those brief seconds before the reset, maybe that matters. Maybe that's all he has. The loneliness of Kenny's situation is specific and irreducible. He is the only being in South Park, possibly in the world, who has the experience he has. He has died dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. He has been to hell. He has been to heaven. He has met Satan and helped him find his courage. He has been the chosen general of God's army. He has been inside Cartman's body, briefly, in the form of his ashes mixed into milk. He knows things about death and the afterlife that no living human knows. And he cannot share a single piece of it because nobody retains the knowledge. He can't even grieve his own deaths, or rather, he can. He's clearly aware of them, he counts them. But he can't grieve them with anyone else because everyone else has forgotten. Every death is private, every return is private. The cost of his immortality is not that he experiences death. It's that he experiences it absolutely alone every single time, with no accumulation of shared memory to soften it or contextualize it or give it meaning in conversation. Think about that for a minute. The things that make difficult experiences bearable in most human lives are shared. You go through something hard and then you talk about it. You compare notes. You find out that other people have been through something similar and you feel less alone. Kenny doesn't have that. There is nobody to talk to. There is nobody who remembers. Every time he wakes up in his bed, it begins again, from scratch, alone. The line from the Necronomicon, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die," works differently when you think about it from Kenny's perspective. He is that which cannot die. He lies dormant, returns, lies again. Death cannot touch him permanently, but it can touch him repeatedly. Can walk him, and it can do so in the most isolating way imaginable. The Lovecraftian horror of his situation isn't that he dies, it's that he is, in some fundamental sense, beyond the reach of the one thing that usually connects people to each other. We share our mortality. We are bonded by the knowledge that we will all eventually die. Kenny is excluded from that bond. He will not die, and somehow that makes him more alone than anyone. let's think about Kenny's perspective for a moment. Not in the abstract, but specifically. What it actually means to be carrying what he carries. There's a particular kind of knowledge that only comes from experience, and Kenny's experience is unlike anything a human being is supposed to accumulate. He knows what happens after you die, not from faith or theology or someone else's account, but from doing it repeatedly under circumstances ranging from mundane to genuinely cosmic. He has had, among other things, quite a productive conversation with Satan about the nature of codependency, which is a sentence I find extraordinary every time I consider it. And then he wakes up and goes to school. He sits in Mr. Garrison's class, later Mr. Mackey's class, surrounded by children whose greatest anxiety is about the upcoming maths test or whether Wendy Testaberger likes them. He eats whatever's available at home, frozen waffles if they're lucky, bread sandwiches if they're not. He does his homework. He watches his parents fight. He goes to bed in the same orange parka he wears during the day in a house where the family console is 15 years out of date, knowing things about the nature of reality and the afterlife that no theologian, no philosopher, no scientist has ever had direct access to. And he can't tell anyone, not because they disbelieve him, though they would, but because even when they believe him in the moment, they forget. The knowledge can't be transferred. It dies with the memory of each death. Now, there's the Cartman angle. Earlier, in Cartman land, Cartman says something offhand that suggests he has more memory of Kenny's deaths than anyone else. That he dies all the time, and Cartman says it with a casualness that implies genuine recollection, not just speculation. The fan theory, which fits the available evidence fairly neatly, is that Cartman received Kenny's corneas in a transplant at some point, and that this gave him an intermittent, partial connection to Kenny's experience. Not full memory, not real understanding, just flickers. If that's true, and the show never confirms it, this is an interpretation, then the cruelest part of the setup is this. The one person with any access to what Kenny experiences is Cartman. The one person least likely to do anything compassionate or meaningful with that access. The one person most likely to file it under useful if it benefits me, irrelevant otherwise. The universe handed Kenny's secret to the worst possible keeper, and that is so specifically South Park that it almost has to be intentional. What would it mean to know what Kenny knows? To have been on both sides repeatedly? To have met the neighbors of God and of Satan and come back with no way to prove or share any of it? There's something almost mystical in that if you look at it from a certain angle. Every major religion in history has organized itself around the testimony of people who claim to have encountered the divine, to have seen what was on the other side. That testimony has shaped civilizations. And Kenny McCormick has been there, genuinely been there beyond any reasonable doubt, and can tell nobody, and nobody would remember if he told them anyway. He just goes to school, he works at City Walk, he plays Magic, The Gathering, he protects his sister. He keeps quiet, keeps going, does the small things that are available to him. And somewhere underneath the orange parka and the muffled speech and the death every Tuesday routine, he carries the full weight of knowing more about the nature of existence than any human being alive. I find that genuinely remarkable, and I find it genuinely funny, which is the kind of combination that South Park specializes in when it's operating at its best. We've talked about the mythology and the emotional texture of Kenny's deaths at some length, but I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't slow down and actually appreciate some of them individually. Because for all the genuine darkness underneath the death gag, the deaths themselves were often wonderfully, specifically crafted pieces of comedy. They deserve their own attention. Some of them got it. There's the dinner table one. Season 2's The List. The family is sitting around eating Pop-Tarts, which we've established is how the McCormick family marks a good evening, and a stray bullet comes through the wall and hits Kenny. No build-up, no warning, just stray bullet. Kenny gone, the Pop-Tarts continue. It's such a bleak little image, and it's delivered so flatly that it works precisely because the show refuses to comment on it. There's the Put It Down episode from season 21, where Kenny is killed off-screen by a driver on their phone. His photograph appears among a tribute montage of children killed by distracted drivers, just a face among faces. It's one of the quieter deaths, and somehow one of the more unsettling ones, because it's stripped of any absurdist invention. Just a car, a phone, a kid, and a photo in a presentation. The bike parade death is one of the more recent ones with a specific comedic hook. Jeff Bezos instructs his Alexa device to kill Kenny. Alexa apparently complies. Cartman, later in the same episode, is seen riding his bike in the parade while hauling Kenny's coffin behind him. The image of Cartman in a bike parade dragging a coffin with the same neutral expression he brings to everything. I have seen that image and I stand by the view that it is very funny. The pandemic special gets a mention because it's one of the most pointed of the late-era deaths. The children of South Park break out of COVID quarantine, having reached their collective limit, and the police respond with militarized equipment, the kind of hardware that the episode is very clearly making a comment about. Kenny is shot in the chaos in a way that sits uncomfortably close to something other than pure comedy. The show uses his death here to make a point, which is a shift from the early era where the point was the absence of a point. Major boogage is worth a mention for a completely different reason. This is the episode where Kenny discovers that inhaling cat urine, known in the episode as cheesing, causes intense hallucinations of a kingdom made entirely of breasts, populated by a warrior woman from the 1981 animated film Heavy Metal named Tarna. Kenny becomes addicted to cheesing. He gets sober. He relapses at the end of the episode when he finds some flowers and sniffs them. The flowers apparently also do it. He goes right back to the kingdom of breasts. This has nothing to do with the mythology. I simply think it's important that you know this happened. And then there's the tombstone in the opening credits, which gets a mention here because it ties everything together in miniature. Sleep well, little child, the Lord holds thee now. Placed on a grave in a cartoon, appearing in the opening of a show that will then go on to kill its character in increasingly creative ways. It's a joke, obviously, but it's also, if you take it seriously for a moment, a genuinely sweet inscription. Sleep well, the Lord holds thee. As if whoever put those words on the stone actually meant them. As if they were comforting Kenny specifically, a kid who keeps dying and keeps coming back, telling him that every time he goes somewhere safe. That somebody has him. That tombstone has been in the opening credits since the beginning. It's been there through every death, every return, every season. It's still there. Kenny still goes somewhere safe. He always wakes up in his bed. Season 6, Episode 12, A Ladder to Heaven. This is the episode that aired while Kenny was still gone, still in the extended absence of Season 6, following his permanent death at the end of Season 5. The boys need Kenny's ticket stub to claim a prize from a candy shop. Without Kenny, there's no ticket stub, and without the ticket stub, there's no prize. So Cartman, in an act of what he frames as grief but is transparently motivated by wanting the prize, announces that they should mix Kenny's ashes with milk and drink them, so that Kenny's memories will transfer to Cartman and he'll remember where the ticket stub is. This works, incidentally. Cartman drinks Kenny's ashes and Kenny's soul takes up residence inside him. What follows is one of the more interesting and surprisingly emotional threads in the show's run, delivered in Cartman's typical register of self-interest and manipulation, but occasionally breaking into something genuinely stranger. Kenny's presence inside Cartman produces moments of unexpected decency. Cartman performing acts of kindness that are visibly not coming from him, that don't fit the patterns of his behavior at all, as if someone else is briefly steering. There's a scene where Cartman, apparently channeling Kenny, builds something useful and helpful for the community, and the expression on his face while he does it is wrong in a way that's hard to articulate. He looks like himself, but isn't behaving like himself. This is also the episode where the show does something fairly daring. It takes the afterlife completely seriously within the logic of the episode and uses it to say something about grief. The boys build an actual ladder, trying to reach heaven to speak to Kenny. The endeavor is absurd and doomed and very funny. But the feeling underneath it, 4 kids trying to talk to their dead friend, trying to find some way to bridge the gap between where they are and where he is tender in a way South Park doesn't often let itself be for this long. The show keeps adding layers to the Kenny and Cartman storyline. Kenny's soul is apparently strong enough that it starts affecting Cartman's dreams, his behavior, his choices. Cartman, who is the most comprehensively selfish character in the show's history, briefly becomes an instrument of something gentler. It doesn't last. It couldn't. But while it does, it shows you exactly how much of a presence Kenny has always been. How much he had always been doing, quietly, that only becomes visible in its absence. What the episode also does, in a small but pointed way, is establish that Kenny's soul is powerful. Not in a dramatic, plot-relevant way, just in the sense that it's coherent and persistent, and capable of operating on its own terms even when housed in the most inhospitable possible vessel. Whatever Kenny is, whatever the nature of his immortality and his curse, the soul underneath it is robust. It has integrity. It keeps its shape. This matters more than the episode makes explicit, because later in the Mysterion trilogy, when Kenny's immortality is finally explained and explored, what we see is a soul that has been through extraordinary things and is still, somehow, functional. Still capable of love, still protective of his sister, still capable of choosing selflessness at the most critical moments. The Ashes episode is the earliest hint that the repeated deaths are not eroding something. Kenny is not diminished by his condition, he's just tired. There's something clarifying about that, if you think about it. The horror of Kenny's situation is real, and the loneliness is real, and the toll is real. But it hasn't broken him. He keeps coming back. And he keeps being more or less himself. There's a version of the Kenny story that I've been telling tonight that's built around the big moments, the deaths, the Mysterion reveal, the movie, the post-COVID specials. Those are the load-bearing events, the things you need to understand who he is. But there's another version of the story that runs alongside it, made up of smaller moments, episodes that aren't about Kenny specifically, but feature him in ways that accumulate into something. A texture, a personality, an actual person rather than just a mythology. Let me meander through some of that. There's the episode The Ring from season 13 where Kenny gets a girlfriend. Her name is Tammy Warner, and she has, to put it in the show's terms, a certain reputation. Kenny is overjoyed. He is 9 years old, and the prospect of a girlfriend with this reputation is, to him, close to the pinnacle of life experience. The storyline takes a turn when the Jonas Brothers, who are a real target of the episode's satire, their abstinence ring campaign receiving thorough South Park treatment, get involved, and Kenny ends up wearing a purity ring and abandoning his romantic ambitions. The episode is funny in the usual South Park way, but what's notable is the character consistency. Kenny is enthusiastic, earnest, easily pleased, and fundamentally decent, even when he's also being a 9-year-old boy about things. He doesn't scheme. He just really likes Tammy Warner and is happy about it, and then sad about it, and then goes home. Chicken pox? Season 2 is an episode I think about when people discuss Kenny's social dynamics. The parents of South Park decide, in their wisdom, to deliberately expose their children to chickenpox by arranging playdates with sick kids. The logic being to get it over with while they're young. The episode reveals that Stuart McCormick and Gerald Broflovsky were childhood friends. They grew up together. Their boys grew up in entirely different circumstances. One family comfortable, one family struggling. And the episode quietly uses that contrast to make a point about poverty and how it shapes both people who experience it and people who observe it. Kenny is there throughout, watching the adults fumble, getting chicken pox, going on with it. The friendship between Gerald and Stuart, which predates the show and has presumably been running through all the times Kenny and Kyle have been friends, adds a small historical depth to the McCormick family that the show mostly doesn't bother with. Cartman Land Waste, or Season 5, is ostensibly about Cartman inheriting a theme park and Kyle having a crisis of faith, but it contains the line delivered by Cartman with his characteristic casual self-absorption that Kenny dies all the time, said in passing, meant as nothing, but flagged, if you're paying attention, as one of the earliest indications that someone in this group has more awareness of the death cycle than the show has acknowledged. That throwaway line plants a seed the Mysterion trilogy would later grow. Lice Capades, Season 11, is the episode where Kenny is briefly unhooded, one of his clearest face reveals outside the movie. And his voice, clear and slightly surprising, is provided by Eric Stuff. The episode is about lice living on Clyde's hair, which developed their own civilization and mythology. Kenny is a secondary character, but the face is there, available, just briefly, a normal kid's face. Unremarkable. Ordinary. That's always the effect of seeing it. All that mythology and all that cosmic weight, and underneath it, there's just a kid's face. Going Native, Season 16, is the Butters episode I mentioned earlier. The one where Butters says Kenny is the only kid at school with real dignity. I want to return to it slightly because it's also the episode where Kenny voluntarily goes to Hawaii with Butters to support him through a personal crisis without being asked and without making anything of it. He just goes. Because Butters needs someone and Kenny is available, and that's enough of a reason. The episode is mostly Butters focused and Kenny is in the background of it, but his presence there, his choice to show up, is itself a piece of characterization. Naughty Ninjas, Season 19, has a small moment where Stuart is on the phone with the police, arguing that the homeless people gathering outside their house are scaring his kids. And he mentions all three of them by implication. Kevin, Kenny, Karen. It's a tiny thing, but it's Stuart who is mostly portrayed as negligent and self-absorbed, demonstrating that he knows his children are scared, that he's bothered by it, that there's a version of Stuart McCormick that would go to bat for his kids if the stakes were legible enough to him. The McCormick family is not a simple unit of pure dysfunction. It's a complicated one. Most families are. And then there's Major Boobage. I mentioned the cheesing earlier but didn't linger, which is notable for giving Kenny a genuinely full A-plot across an entire episode. He discovers the cat urine hallucination. He becomes addicted to it. He goes through the stages of addiction in a way the show takes seriously-ish. He gets clean. He relapses cheerfully at the end. The episode is structured around Kenny's perspective in a way most early and mid-season episodes weren't, and it makes you realize how much is there when the show actually looks at him. He carries a story. He has a perspective. The episode is funny, and he's funny in it, and that's enough, but it also just demonstrates, again, that when South Park decides to make Kenny a subject rather than a function, there's something real to work with. These quieter episodes are, I think, the connective tissue of the Kenny story. The big mythological moments matter enormously, but they matter in the context of all these smaller moments. The girlfriend he was excited about, the holiday he took for someone else's benefit. The face you briefly see and immediately recognize is just a face. That's the person underneath the curse. That's who goes home to the bungalow every night. I want to step back a bit and think about what Kenny actually did to South Park as a piece of television. Not what he did within the fiction, we've covered that thoroughly, but what the writer's evolving relationship with him did to the show itself. South Park premiered in 1997 with a very clear philosophy. Nothing is sacred, nothing lasts, nothing accumulates. The show was deliberately structured to resist the kind of emotional investment that other serialized dramas asked of their audience. Every episode ended, in one sense or another, with a reset. No character development was permanent. No relationship change was retained. The boys were always exactly who they were when the episode started, because that was the joke and that was the point. Serialization was for shows that took themselves seriously. South Park didn't take itself seriously. Kenny's deaths were the purest expression of that philosophy. He died, nobody cared. Next week, he was back. It was the show saying as loudly as it could, "Nothing means anything here, and that's fine, and you shouldn't expect otherwise." And then, gradually, not all at once, but incrementally over years, something changed. The first crack appeared in Kenny Dies, which took the death gag and ran it in the opposite direction. Slow, consequential, genuinely affecting. The show found out, somewhat to its own surprise, that the audience could feel things about Kenny, that the running gag had built up a reservoir of investment that could be tapped, that death, even comedic cartoon death, could land hard if you stopped treating it as a throwaway. The second crack was the Mysterion trilogy, which retroactively recontextualized everything. Once you know that Kenny is aware of his deaths, that he experiences them, that the perpetual forgetting is a source of genuine anguish, every previous death becomes different. The joke doesn't stop being a joke, but it gains a dimension. It becomes a joke with a person inside it. A joke that knows it's a joke and is exhausted by it. That's a much more interesting joke. And the third crack, less a crack, more a quiet revelation, was Karen. Because Karen established for the first time a consistent, ongoing story for Kenny that had nothing to do with dying and coming back. A relationship. A responsibility. A reason to exist beyond the gag. Kenny became a character with a private life and private motivations that the show could return to across seasons without it feeling like a special event. He was just a brother, a guardian angel, a boy buying a doll on a limited budget. The cumulative effect of these three shifts is that Kenny went from being a device to being a character. That transformation happened slowly and without announcement over roughly 15 seasons. And it happened because the writers were willing to follow the implications of what they'd built. They started with a gag, the disposable kid, and ended up with something considerably more complex. A kid who cannot be disposed of, who experiences everything, who protects quietly, who chooses selflessness every time there's a choice to make, and who has been doing all of this for 40 years, in-universe eventually, without asking for recognition or even a thank you. There is a version of this story that reads as tragic. Kenny's condition is a curse. The loneliness of it is real. And the fact that he's essentially invisible, that his contributions and his sacrifices are perpetually forgotten, is genuinely unfair. He deserved better in the way that most people who grow up in difficult circumstances and do good things with what they have deserve better. But there's another version that reads as something closer to grace. Because Kenny's goodness doesn't depend on being remembered. His protectiveness toward Karen doesn't require her to know it's him. His sacrifice in the movie doesn't require the boys to understand what he gave up. His lifetime of work in the post-COVID future doesn't require credit or legacy or a moment where the world turns and notices him. He does what he does because it's what he does. He is, in that sense, completely free of the ego dependence that drives almost every other character in the show. Cartman needs to win. Kyle needs to be right. Stan needs to matter. Kenny just needs to be there, doing the next right thing. The show spent 27 seasons building that portrait. It did it across deaths and resurrections and long absences and Mysterion costumes and cardboard boxes of possessions and small cardboard boxes and cans of green beans without openers. It did it through a muffled voice that nobody quite understood. And what it built, in the end, is one of the most quietly remarkable characters in the history of animated television. There's something worth saying here about what Parker and Stone actually created when they made Kenny. They've described the character in interviews as coming partly from a real person, a childhood acquaintance of Trey Parker's, also named Kenny, who wore a similar orange parka and who died young. The real Kenny. The person behind the gag. I don't think the fictional Kenny is meant to be a portrait of that person, but I do think the warmth underneath the character, The decency that keeps showing up despite the chaos around it comes from somewhere real, from someone Parker actually knew and missed. That's speculation, and I won't push it further. But it adds something, I think, to the question of why Kenny, of all the characters on the show, ended up being the one who got the most honest kind of heroism. Not the loud kind, not the triumphant kind, the quiet, thankless, persistent kind. The kind that looks like just showing up for 40 years for the people you love. Since we're on the topic of what persists, of what keeps showing up across all the seasons and all the changes, it seems right to circle back to the bungalow one more time. We started there, and there's more worth saying about it. The McCormick house is one of those small, persistent details that the show uses as shorthand. You see it, and you know where you are in the social geography of South Park. The dismantled car in the yard, the stray cats, the general atmosphere of a place that's been doing its best with limited resources for a long time. Inside, the ColecoVision, the monochrome television, whatever food happens to be available that evening. But here's what I think about the McCormick house that doesn't usually get said. It's full of people who love each other, chaotically, badly sometimes, in the way that people who are under tremendous stress and have limited emotional vocabulary love each other, which is to say, with a lot of noise and a lot of conflict and intermittent moments of genuine warmth that don't last as long as they should. Stuart and Carol fight constantly, but Stuart, when sober, is described as loving. Carol has had Kenny reborn from her body by the show's own count over 50 times. She is tired of it, she says so, but she keeps placing the baby in the crib. She keeps putting the parka on. She keeps raising this child who she knows is going to die, and she does it again and again and again. There's something in that if you let yourself look at it. She's not a good mother in any conventional sense. She and Stuart have not given their children the stability or safety or material comfort that children deserve. But Carol McCormick has also, by the time the Coon and Friends trilogy ends, given birth to Kenny McCormick over 50 times. She has done that repeatedly under circumstances she didn't choose and couldn't control because of a cult meeting she went to for free beer. She says, "We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting with regret, not with cruelty." She knows something went wrong. She feels the wrongness of it. She just doesn't have the tools to fix it. Kenny across the series seems to know this. He doesn't seem to harbor resentment toward his parents in any explicit way. He just works around them, the way he works around everything. He gets a job when he needs money. He puts on a costume when Karen needs protecting. He fills the gaps that the adults in his life leave open. He learned early that the gaps would be there, and he stopped expecting otherwise. The house is also where Kenny comes back to. Every time, every death, every resurrection, every morning. He wakes up there, in his bed, in his parka, in the bungalow with the stray cats outside and the ColecoVision in the corner. Whatever he's been through, wherever he's gone, the return is always to this specific place. That's home. Unmade bed, cold morning, orange parka, begin again. There's a strange comfort in that, actually, and I think that's partly intentional. The show could have placed Kenny's returns anywhere. In the school, at the bus stop, at Cartman's house, but he always wakes up at home. His reset point is the McCormick house, with its threadbare dignity and its unreliable adults, and its particular smell of things that should be fixed but haven't been yet. That's where he starts, every time. Kevin is usually there somewhere, arguing with someone. Karen is sometimes asleep. Stuart and Carol are in some state of consciousness ranging from caffeinated to entirely insensible. And Kenny gets up, gets dressed, and goes to the bus stop. Because that's Tuesday. Because that's every day. Because the bus is coming and there's school and his friends are going to be there and the sun is out over South Park, Colorado, and the snow is on the ground. And that's enough. I don't know. There's something I find very peaceful about that image. The kid in the orange parka walking to the bus stop through the snow, carrying everything he knows about life and death and the nature of the cosmos, and just going to school anyway. Because what else are you going to do? You go to school, you meet your friends, you get through the day, and then you come home and then you do it again. I want to spend a bit of time on the choices because when you look at the full arc of Kenny's story, from the bus stop in season 1 to the laboratory in the post-COVID specials, what you find is a character who made choices. Real ones, not choices in the dramatic sense of choosing between obvious good and obvious evil, but choices in the quieter sense of choosing what to do with what you have and who to be in the face of what's happening to you. The first choice is the wish in the movie. He had one, he used it for everyone else. He could have brought himself back and nobody would have faulted him for it. He'd been through enough, been to hell and back, watched a war happen from the other side. Nobody would have said anything. But he looked at the damage around him and decided the wish was more useful going outward. That's not a small thing. That's a statement about values, made quietly, without a speech. The second kind of choice is the costume. Kenny doesn't have to be Mysterion. Nobody assigned him that role. Nobody told him to put on a cape and patrol the school grounds protecting his sister. He chose it. He invented it. He decided that the only useful thing he could do with his curse, his knowledge of death, his ability to return from it, was to use it in service of someone vulnerable. The guardian angel thing isn't the universe's plan for him. It's his own. The third kind of choice is the work. In the post-COVID future, when we learn what Kenny became, it isn't glamorous in the way you'd expect from someone with his unique advantages. He could have done anything, presumably, gone into finance, cashed in on whatever insights his repeated deaths gave him about the nature of reality, lived comfortably on the strainness of his situation. Instead, he became a scientist. He worked on the thing that was making the world worse. He tried to go back and fix it. He spent, apparently, a significant portion of his adult life trying to repair a friendship between 3 men who, by all appearances, had given up on each other. Because those were his 3 friends. Because that's what you do for your friends if you can, apparently, even if it takes you 40 years in a time machine. There's a way of reading Kenny McCormick that places him entirely within his victimhood. The poor kid, the cursed kid, the one who dies alone and forgotten and has no power over any of it. And that reading is not wrong. Those things are all true. He is poor and cursed and largely forgotten, and he doesn't have control over the fundamental conditions of his life. But that reading is also incomplete because the other thing that's true is that given all of those conditions, he keeps making the same kind of choice. Outward-facing, protective, generous, not performatively, not in the way characters in lesser stories perform their goodness, but as a matter of habit, as if it simply doesn't occur to him to do otherwise. What's notable is not the scale of any single choice. It's the consistency across all of them. The wish, the costume, the work, the time machine all point the same direction, outward, away from himself, toward whoever needs something. A different person in the same circumstances could easily have made different choices. Kenny's are his own, and they add up quietly across the whole run of the show to something that looks a lot like a life well spent. Since we've talked about it a few times in passing, the afterlife, the cosmic structure of the South Park universe, I want to slow down and spend a bit of time on it, because Kenny has more direct experience of it than any other character, and the show's theology is actually fairly specific and fairly strange, and worth laying out properly. In the South Park cosmology, heaven and hell are both real, both populated, and both broadly recognizable, while also being somewhat unusual. Hell, as we've discussed, is where Kenny first properly appears after the movie sends him there. Satan is in charge, which is presented as essentially administrative rather than punitive. He's running a place, doing a job, dealing with the particular challenges of managing an infinite institution full of the deceased. The Satan of South Park is famously a thoughtful and somewhat emotionally sensitive entity who, for most of his appearances, is dealing with a difficult relationship rather than tormenting souls. He's in a codependent dynamic with Saddam Hussein, who is manipulative and loud and persistently unpleasant, and Satan keeps almost ending the relationship and then not ending it because he's lonely and Saddam is there. Kenny, arriving in hell, navigates it with the ease of someone who's been in a lot of unusual situations. He makes himself useful. He talks to Satan. He observes what's happening, the manipulation, the war, the mounting crisis, and he engages with it. He doesn't panic. He doesn't despair. He's been here before in the sense of being dead before, and the new information he's gathering, there's a whole war on, Satan needs encouragement, Saddam is the problem, gets processed and acted on. He helps Satan find his courage. That's not nothing. That's a significant contribution to the resolution of a divine conflict, made by a 9-year-old from a poverty-stricken home in Colorado who happened to be in the right place and paid attention. Heaven, as glimpsed in the movie and in the Best Friends Forever episode, is the other direction. And it's enormous, and it has an army, and it apparently needs a general who can fight using skills derived from handheld gaming systems. The theology of South Park Heaven involves an active conflict with hell, a god who makes decisions and who, in other episodes, turns out to be a distinctive-looking creature who gives very few explanations for his choices, and angels and bureaucracies and celestial hierarchies that function somewhat like corporate structures. Kenny has been through all of this. He's been on both sides. He has a working knowledge of the full cosmological picture that no living human in South Park possesses. What's interesting is that this knowledge doesn't make him grandiose. He doesn't walk around with the bearing of someone who has spoken to God's generals and dined, loosely speaking, in hell. He walks around like a kid, because that's what he is. The cosmic knowledge is real, and it's his, and it's in there somewhere. But it sits inside the same person who gets excited about getting a girlfriend and develops ethical concerns about roosters and works at City Walk for his sister's doll. The scale of what Kenny knows doesn't change the scale of what Kenny is. He's still a boy. He's still going to the bus stop in the morning. There's something I find genuinely moving about that. The cosmological scale of his experience and the smallness of his daily life exist side by side without apparent contradiction, because Kenny doesn't seem to think there's a contradiction. He is both things at once, the child with the cosmic knowledge and the kid who needs to get to school, and he doesn't let either one cancel out the other. The show, I think, is doing something deliberate here with the relationship between the big and the small. South Park's cosmology is enormous. Heaven, hell, ancient cosmic entities, the forces of good and evil locked in permanent conflict. And in the middle of all of that is a 9-year-old boy from a bungalow with a ColecoVision who has somehow become, through no fault or planning of his own, the person who has seen more of it than anyone else. The universe is vast and incomprehensible, and its most experienced witness is a child who can't be clearly heard when he tries to speak. That's very funny. It's also, I think, true to something. The people who know the most about the real weight of things are often the ones whose voices are the least audible in the rooms where decisions get made. Kenny McCormick is a cartoon about that, among other things. I keep coming back to the group dynamic because I think it's where Kenny's character is most legible. He exists in relation to these 3 other people, and the shape of those relationships, what he gives to each of them, what each of them gives back or doesn't, tells you a lot. With Stan, there's a quiet ease. Stan is the most emotionally available of the 4 boys, the one most likely to actually sit with a feeling rather than run from it or weaponize it. He and Kenny don't have many scenes of their own. The friendship is mostly expressed through proximity, through being in the same place doing the same thing for 27 seasons. But when the show does give them a direct moment, it tends to be warm. The Kenny Dies episode is the clearest example. Stan's inability to visit Kenny in the hospital isn't indifference, it's the opposite. He's too affected. He cares too much to watch it happen, which is a very specific and very recognizable kind of love. His guilt after Kenny's death, I was Kenny's worst friend, is real. It sits in him. And when Cartman's selfishness is exposed, Stan's relief is also real. He wasn't the worst one. He failed, but he wasn't the worst one. That distinction matters to him. You get the sense that Kenny would have understood if he'd had the chance to say so. With Kyle, the dynamic is steadier. Kyle is the moral compass of the group. He argues for what's right, he holds the line, he doesn't let things slide when they should be challenged. And Kenny, being fundamentally decent himself, moves through life in a way that doesn't put him in conflict with Kyle's values very often. They don't fight. They don't have the same kind of friction that Kyle has with Cartman, the constant ideological warfare. Kenny is just there on Kyle's side of the ledger most of the time by temperament. Best Friends Forever has Kyle fighting to keep Kenny alive with a genuine conviction that reads as friendship, not just ethics. He believes Kenny deserves to come back. He fights for it loudly and persistently in a way that is very Kyle. With Cartman, it's the strangest of the three and probably the most South Park. Cartman exploits Kenny constantly. He uses his poverty against him, uses his loyalty against him, takes advantage of his compliance and his generosity in the particular way that manipulative people take advantage of patient ones, and Kenny mostly lets him. There's no dramatic confrontation, no moment where Kenny puts his foot down about the dynamic. He just absorbs it, continues to call Cartman his friend, shows up for him in the movie and in various other contexts, because that's what Kenny does. He shows up for the people who matter to him, even when they've done nothing to earn it. This is either the most admirable thing about Kenny or the saddest, depending on how you look at it, possibly both. He extends loyalty and generosity to someone who doesn't deserve it repeatedly across seasons. You could read that as a failure to protect himself. You could also read it as a refusal to make his love conditional. Kenny doesn't seem to be waiting for Cartman to become better before he treats him like a friend. He treats him like a friend now, in the present, regardless. That's genuinely radical behavior in a show built on transactional relationships and self-interest. It's also very much in keeping with someone who buys his sister dolls and protects strangers in a costume. The generosity isn't selective, it's just how he is. And then there's the question of what the group is without him, which Season 6 answered if you were paying attention. Without Kenny, the balance is wrong. Butters is too gentle, too credulous, too easily manipulated, and his presence as a replacement makes Cartman's cruelty look darker and less funny than it does when Kenny absorbs it with his particular stoic resilience. Tweak is anxious in a way that fills the room differently. Neither of them are Kenny, and the show knew it. That absence, that wrong-shaped gap, is the best argument for what Kenny contributes to the group. He's the counterweight. He's the person in the composition who keeps it from tipping over. 4 kids at a bus stop. It only works with all 4 of them. It has always only worked with all 4 of them. And the one in the orange parka, the one you can barely hear, the one who keeps coming back, he might be the one you'd miss the most if he were gone. He might be the one holding the whole thing together, quietly, without anyone noticing he was doing it. One thing worth appreciating about Kenny's situation that we haven't talked about directly is the specific town he lives in. South Park, Colorado is not a normal place. It is a place where things happen, constantly, inexplicably, and at a rate that no real Colorado mountain town could sustain. It is a town that has been invaded, destroyed, threatened, reformed, absurdly enriched, inexplicably devastated, visited by celebrities, manipulated by corporations, overrun by various forces, both natural and supernatural, and, at one point, temporarily given over to the administration of a sentient piece of Christmas excrement named Mr. Hanky. Kenny has lived through all of this, every season, every crisis, every wave of madness that swept through South Park. He was there in his orange parka, present for it. He has watched Randy Marsh do an almost incomprehensible number of unhinged things. He was alive for the Scientology episode, the World of Warcraft episode, the entirety of the Tegrity Farm saga, The streaming service wars, the Amazon thing, the Canada wars, both versions of them. He has been a resident of South Park for the full duration of its recorded history as a television setting, and that history involves a volume and variety of incident that would be difficult to survive even without a cosmic immortality curse layered on top. There's something almost meditative about that, actually. The town keeps happening, and Kenny keeps being present for it, and he doesn't seem particularly fazed by any of it. He goes to school, he dies occasionally, he comes back, and the next week some new catastrophe has arrived, and he is there for that too. His baseline has always been extraordinary things happen, and I deal with them, and then I go home. That's just Tuesday. That's every day. Chef, the school cafeteria worker, and for the first 9 seasons, one of the warmest presences in the boys' lives, had a particularly good relationship with Kenny. Chef was broadly available to all 4 boys as a source of wisdom and genuine adult care, but he had a specific fondness for Kenny that came through in the same way his fondness for all of them did, through food, through music, through his willingness to actually show up when they needed him. Chef was one of the adults in South Park who behaved like an adult toward children, which put him in a fairly small category. After his departure from the show, handled badly by the narrative circumstances of his exit, which I won't get into here, his absence was felt by all 4 boys, and probably by Kenny most of all, in the sense that Chef was the kind of grown-up that a child in Kenny's situation needs more than most. The one who treats you like you matter and feeds you something warm. Jesus also appears in early South Park as a fairly regular presence, hosting a public access television show, participating in various civic events, occasionally getting into physical confrontations that a figure of his theological significance probably shouldn't be having. Kenny's relationship with Jesus is never particularly developed, but given that Kenny has extensive first-hand knowledge of heaven and presumably some awareness of the celestial structures that Jesus is presumably connected to, there's a sort of implicit recognition there that the show is too sensible to make explicit. They probably have things to talk about. The show wisely doesn't let them. The broader point is that South Park is a town with an extremely high density of the strange, the sacred, the absurd, and the mundane all occupying the same space. And Kenny occupies it with a particular kind of groundedness. He is not easily shocked. He has been to the extremes, cosmic horror, divine war, literal hell, and he comes back to the middle, to the bus stop, to the cafeteria, to wherever his friends are. The town keeps generating new material for its residents to navigate, and Kenny navigates it with less drama than almost anyone, because for him, the scale of what can happen has always been larger than what he shows. There's a fun detail from Quintuplets 2000, Season 4, where it's implied that Kenny speaks fluent Romanian, which is revealed in passing with absolutely no explanation and never followed up on. No context is given. He just apparently speaks Romanian. I love that. I love the idea of Kenny in his bungalow with the monochrome television and the ColecoVision, having quietly picked up a complete second language at some point and not mentioning it to anyone, because why would you? It's the same instinct that produces all the other quietly extraordinary things about him. He doesn't announce the things he knows, he just knows them. There's also the detail, slipped in somewhere in the middle seasons, that Kenny enjoys looking at Playboys and has been known to sniff paint. Both of these are presented as equally casual facts about his character, which tells you something about the register the show operates in when it comes to Kenny's inner life. He is a 9-year-old boy with the accumulated wisdom of dozens of deaths and a Lovecraftian immortality curse, and he also sniffs paint and reads Playboys. Both are true. Neither cancels out the other. He contains multitudes, as they say. The town of South Park has produced an enormous amount of content over more than 2 decades, and Kenny has been present for essentially all of it. Dying periodically, yes, but present. Watching, processing, speaking muffledly, his ongoing commentary on everything around him into a parka hood that nobody fully hears. Carrying his extraordinary inner life through an extraordinarily strange place and making it home, and going back to it every single morning. That's not nothing. In fact, I think it might be everything, and that's where we end. Not with a revelation, not with a final conclusion, just with the image we started with. The bus stop. 4 small figures in the snow, one of them in an orange parka. It's been there since 1997. It'll probably be there for as long as the show keeps running, which by all available evidence is quite a while longer. Every episode, some version of that scene, the boys at the bus stop, talking, waiting for the bus, killing time, saying whatever they say. And Kenny is there, the hood tight over his face, the voice muffled, saying things that nobody quite catches, but that are clearly worth saying. He is always there, he always was. I've spent a few hours tonight going through everything I know and everything the show gave us about who Kenny McCormick is, and I keep arriving at the same place. He is, for all the mythology and all the comedy and all the deaths, fundamentally a simple character, not uncomplicated. We've seen how complicated he actually is, but simple in the way that people who are clear about what they value are simple. He knows what matters to him. He acts on it consistently without requiring anyone to notice. He loves his sister. He's loyal to his friends. He goes to school and comes home and gets up the next morning and does it again. He does this against a backdrop of a cosmic curse that nobody else remembers and an immortality that isolates rather than empowers, in a bungalow with a dismantled car out front. And his response to all of it is to keep showing up for Karen, for Stan and Kyle, and even for Cartman, in the way you stay loyal to someone who drives you mad because they were there from the beginning, and you've built enough history with them that the alternative, not being there, is unimaginable. For the future, which he spent his whole adult life in the post-COVID specials trying to repair, quietly from a laboratory that nobody else understood. There's a version of Kenny that's about death, the running gag, the horror of the curse, the mythology. And that version is real, and it matters, and I'm glad the show eventually took it seriously. But there's another version of Kenny that has nothing to do with death. That version is about what he did with his life. And that version is, he showed up every time for the people he loved, with whatever was available to him, which was never very much, and which he made the most of without complaining about it. I think that's the real story of Kenny McCormick, not the cosmic one, though the cosmic one is fascinating and strange and very much worth knowing. The real story is the smaller one, the kid who was always at the bus stop, the guardian angel who was also just a brother, the scientist who spent his life trying to fix a friendship because those were his friends and someone had to try, the muffled voice, the orange parka, the snow on the ground. He'll be at that bus stop tomorrow. He always is. I find I keep thinking about the tombstone inscription, which we've now mentioned a couple of times tonight. Sleep well, little child, the Lord holds thee now. Whoever put those words on the grave in the opening credits knew something. Whether it was meant as a joke, which knowing the show, it was, or as something warmer underneath the joke, the effect is the same. Every episode, before anything else happens, before any of the chaos and profanity and satirical excess of a South Park week begins, those words are there, addressed to Kenny, telling him he's safe, telling him to rest. He doesn't always get to rest. That's the whole point. He's back again by morning, parka on, ready for another Tuesday, but the inscription is there anyway. A small, quiet, oddly sincere thing sitting at the front of a loud and irreverent show, as if someone wanted to make sure Kenny knew each week before it all started again, that somewhere in the architecture of this universe, there is a place that holds him, that despite the forgetting and the curse and the bread sandwiches and the dying, there is something that has always been there at the beginning of every episode, looking at him and saying, sleep well. I think there's something in that worth holding on to as you drift off tonight. Not just for Kenny's sake, though I hope he gets a proper rest too, wherever he's currently woken up, but in a more general sense. The things that matter about a person are often the quiet things, the things they do when nobody's watching. The doll they bought, the hand they held, the friendship they spent 40 years trying to fix, the voice that keeps talking even when nobody can quite hear it. Those things count, even if nobody writes them down, even if nobody remembers. And I think that's a good place to stop for tonight. We've been through a lot. The McCormick house, the death gag, the Mysterion mythology, the cult, the movie, Karen, the future, the choices he kept making, the things he knew that nobody else did. There's more to say. There's always more to say with South Park, and I've got plenty of other videos planned that will get into other corners of this universe. The Ministry of Magic. Wait, no, wrong show. The Ministry of Magic is the Hogwarts video. I've been doing too many of these. I mean, I've got more South Park coming, other characters, other threads, other mysteries worth a slow evening. But that's for another night. For now, if you're still awake, well, sleep well. The Lord holds thee now. Take care of yourselves.